Welcome to the Spotlight on approvals for EFT vendor and EFT customer bank account details. We are going to investigate two ways, one using EFT processing and one using extender workflows on top of EFT processing to approve amended bank account details. When it comes to approving customer and vendor EFT bank account details, there are two ways this can be done. Firstly, using EFT processing, we can use the EFT processing security groups and option settings so that one user has the ability to enter or amend customer or vendor EFT bank account details, and the second user can only approve or make active these details. And secondly, using Extender, we can set up a workflow so that when the EFT vendor or EFT customer's bank account details are changed, the EFT vendor or EFT customer's record is made inactive until such time as it is approved by somebody. I'm first going to look at the two-step approvals for EFT bank account details, which is in EFT processing. In the EFT options, you can set up the default EFT status for both EFT customer records and EFT vendor records. And if you set the default status to entered, this means whenever a vendor or customer's EFT details are entered or amended, the status will revert back to entered. And then you have two security groups in EFT. The first one, which allows a user to enter EFT details for vendors and customers, and a second one which allows users only to approve those details. So if you have one group of users who can enter and amend EFT vendor account details, and whenever that's done, the status reverts back to entered, and then a second group of users, and the only field that they can change is the status, and they can move it from entered to active if they approve of the changes, or to inactive if they don't approve of the changes. And you can only create EFT files for vendors and customers if their status is approved. If it is entered or inactive, then you cannot create an EFT file for the customer or vendor. Logging into my company as a user who has access to EFT options, we can check that on the AR tab, the default customer status is entered. So whenever a record is created or amended, the status will revert back to entered. And similarly for AP vendors. So whenever the EFT vendor details is entered or amended, the status will revert back to entered. And only active records can be used in an EFT file. And in admin services, for EFT processing, we have got one security group called Enter, which allows users to enter EFT vendor details and customer details. And another one called Approve, which allows the users only to approve the customer and the vendor's EFT bank account details. And Nancy is applied to the Enter group, and Rob is applied to the Approve group. So logged into the appropriate company is Nancy. She can create new EFT vendor records and amend existing ones, but when she does, the status, you notice, went to entered, and she's not able to change the status. And similarly for EFT customers. And now logged into the same company as Rob, When he goes to the EFT vendor's record, the only field he's allowed to change is the status. So if he approves of these changes, he can make it active. If he doesn't approve, he can make it inactive. Similarly for the EFT customer. And you cannot create an EFT file for a customer or a vendor where the record is not active. If you try and create an EFT file for a vendor or a customer which is inactive, then you will get an error message indicating that the vendor is not active in this case. We have just seen that we can set the default status for EFT vendors and EFT customers to entered, and then have one group of users who's able to edit the EFT vendor and EFT customers' details, and another group of users who's only allowed to approve those details. And using this, we can have a separation of duties for those users who can enter the EFT details and those users who can approve the EFT details. The pros of this is you only need EFT processing, and you can use the EFT audit trails to see what needs approving by filtering on the EFT audit log for the most recent changes since you last approved records. The cons of this is the approvers do not get any alerts or notifications of records waiting for approval. And also the people who do the changes will not get any alerts that their changes have been approved. But using Extender, we can create a workflow template for new and amended EFT vendors and customers' details. And the template can follow any flexible business process in terms of the approval process. You could have a single level approval or multi-level approvals. You could have approvals in serial, so after Anne approves, then Steve must approve, or 2 approvals or 3 approvals in parallel. So these 3 users need to do the approval, but in any order. The approvers can be notified via email when there are records for them to approve, and they have a workflow console to view all their outstanding tasks. And with remote action, you could approve the changes on an external website and not have to log into Sage 300 to do the approval. Or with Workflow Anywhere, you can approve using a mobile device, and you can use either a phone or a tablet, iOS or Android or Windows, to approve or reject the records waiting for your approval. We are now going to look at 2 workflow templates for approving the changes to EFT vendors and customers. In the first one, the workflow template will simply notify the approvers via email that there are records for them to approve or reject, but they will still go and use the EFT vendor or customer screen to do the approval or rejection. In the second one, we're going to notify the approvers via email, and the approver can either use the Workflow console to approve or reject the record, or the Workflow Anywhere app to approve or reject the record, or can use the Remote Action Service to approve or reject the record without having to log into Sage 300. And in all these 3 cases, the person who did the initial change is sent an email when the change is approved or rejected. And we're going to use EFT vendors in both instances, but the same process can work on EFT customers. In the first example, Nancy's going to update the EFT vendor. EFT will automatically set the status for the EFT vendor to entered, and the workflow template will automatically get started because the status has been amended, and it will send an email to Anne and then complete the workflow instance. When Anne receives the email, she'll go back to the EFT vendor screen and update the status to active. In this first example, we have a very simple workflow template which is attached to the EFT vendor's status field. So whenever the status field changes, the user is assigned to Anne, and Anne is sent an email notifying her that the status field has changed. Logged in as Nancy, when she makes a change to the EFT vendor's records, As we saw previously, the status immediately goes back to entered. But the workflow has also kicked in and sent Anne an email to alert her that this EFT vendor is now waiting for approval. Anne receives the email that vendor 1200 Chloride Systems EFT details has changed, and the change was done by Nancy on the 23rd of August. And so back in Sage 300, logged in as Anne, she can go to that EFT vendor record, check the details, and if she's happy, she can change the status to active or leave it entered or inactive if the details are not correct. We have now seen the very simple example of notifying the approvers via email when there's a record for them to approve. Now we're going to look at a second workflow template where the approvers are sent an email when there's a record waiting for them to approve, and they will be able to approve either by using the Workflow Console, the Workflow Anywhere app, or Remote Action Service if they don't need to log into Sage 300 first. And then the person who did the initial change will be sent an email when their record has been approved or rejected. In this second example, Susan's going to create the EFT vendor record. EFT will automatically set the status to entered, and because the status field has changed, Extender Workflow is going to automatically kick in and create a workflow instance. It's going to create the approval form in AWS. It's going to send an email to the accounts group. When Anne receives the email, she's going to review the form in AWS. She's going to review the instance using the Workflow Anywhere app, and then she's going to use the console to approve the EFT record. Once approved, Extender is going to set the vendor's status to active and log the change has happened, and send Sue an email to say that her changes have been approved, and then complete the workflow instance. In this example, the workflow template has a few more steps, as there are different steps we want to do when a new EFT vendor is created as opposed to when an EFT vendor's records are amended. In either case, the workflow instance gets assigned to a group called Accounts. And this workflow template is attached to the EFT vendor record to the status field when it changes. And the workflow is assigned to the accounts group, and these are the members of the accounts group. Logged in as Susan, we're going to create a new EFT vendor record. And when the record is created, the workflow instance is created, and all the members of the accounts group are sent an email to go ahead and approve or reject these details. And Susan receives a message accordingly. The status remains entered on the EFT vendor until such time as it's approved. Anne receives an email with the details of the new EFT vendor that Susan has created. And she can either click here to approve or reject on the workflow console if she's in the office, or she can click on the remote action link to use the remote website if she is not in the office and would like to approve or reject from there. Or if Anne has been assigned as a workflow app user, she can connect to the same company and review all her workflow instances on her mobile device, in this case my phone, and I could approve or reject from here. But assuming she is in the office and clicks on the Workflow Console link, and all the workflow instances that are due for her approval, either because of the group she is in or that they've been assigned directly to her, will be visible. And from here she can drill down and see the details. Or she could reassign, approve, or reject. When working on your workflow console, you can also sort the workflow instances by type. For example, if I was only interested in seeing my accounts type workflow instances, I can filter on the accounts group. Or I could filter by applying a filter to see only those workflow instances from a certain template. And if I was happy to approve these details, I could click Approve. This workflow template has a comment, which is mandatory to approve. And when the workflow instance is approved, it drops off the console. It will send Susan an email telling her that the details have been approved, and it will log the instance, and it will update the EFT vendor status to active. In EFT Processing, the vendor record has been marked active. In the Extender Workflow Summary log, we can see that Susan submitted the vendor details for approval and approved. And we can see the approval comment that Anne entered. And Sue receives an email that the vendor 1202 Chloride Systems EFT vendor account details record has been approved by Anne. We have now seen two examples of two different business processes of notifying people when a record has been changed and needs approval, and also using the Extender workflows to do the approval as well. Using Extender, you have a full history of who did what when, and it's able to send configurable emails at any step along the way. The advantages of using Extender is you have alerts and notifications of records waiting for approval, you have the workflow history for details on multi-level approvals, and you have other features of Extenders for logging, alerting, workflow, and customization. The cons of using Extender is you need to purchase Extender, either the Developer Edition or the Configurator Edition, depending on the complexity of the business process or workflow template that you need. For more information on EFT Processing or Extender, please go to our website www.orchid.systems. Thanks for your time.